intrigued by extraordinary people, by extraordinary events, by people who can do things. As soon as I see someone can levitate, I was like, I want to know all about that. How do you go about this? Someone who can, Carolyn Mace talks about defying gravity, or Joel Goldsmith says that in the presence of the God realized, the laws of the physical world do not apply. Can you make electronic equipment stop with your consciousness and so on? And those kinds of things, those extraordinary accomplishments. I just read a book that just blew me away. I don't know if you've read this, called Unbroken by Laura Hillerbrand. Have any of you read that? Unbroken? It's one of the great reads you'll ever read in your life, and it's the story of a man who survived impossible things, and he's now 94 years old, and he was shot down during World War II, and he cruised on a raft across the Pacific Ocean. Every word of it is true, but the extraordinariness of this being and what he accomplished and how he survived, those things, I just think that we need to address ourselves, people like us who have a big audience, to creating a world of extraordinary people who look beyond what they were programmed to become, ordinary, filling out the forms and so on, to those where we can expand and really change the world. This kind of thing can really, truly impact the entire consciousness of this planet. I really think it can happen.
Yes. And the basis for that, so in a way, we are talking about creating, and earlier you mentioned that part within everyone, the essence that is timeless and infinite, and that's the being. And so conscious union with that can then lead to awakened, as I call it, awakened doing. So if we go back for a moment to the being part, as Wayne was speaking and as I am speaking, pointing towards that dimension within you, the question is whether at this very moment, so that it's not another belief in your mind. I mean, it's comforting to believe I am an infinite being, but that's a belief. And then can you sense the reality of that? And as we sit here, can we sense the reality of that within ourselves, where you are no longer deriving your sense of identity or your sense of who you are from ideas in your head? That's the start. Because in the normal consciousness, which is unconsciousness, who you feel you are, which of course is the limited self, the conditioned self, the time-bound self, what the Buddha called the self, the delusion, what Jesus pointed to when he said, deny thyself, as one of the essential points of his teaching. Deny thyself, been misinterpreted by the churches as if you had to say, oh, miserable me. That's not it at all. Deny thyself is recognize the unreality of that self, of that basing your sense of who you are on what ideas you hold in your head, thoughts, in other words, that tell you about your story, about who you are, and never feeling really fulfilled. It's always not quite sufficient, so you need to defend this mental edifice of who you are, and so on. You need to add to it. Maybe then I'll be fully myself when I achieve that. So at this moment, can you sense that within you there is an unconditioned, timeless consciousness which has nothing to do with thinking, which is prior to all thinking, which is, you cannot make it into an object and say, there it is, because it's the eternal subject, it's the I, the one I, it's spacious presence, I'm just using different pointers because different pointers work for different people. It's spacious presence, it's a sense of deep aliveness that has nothing to do with your history whatsoever, and nothing to do with your future whatsoever. So if you can touch that within you, that is the liberation from the false sense of self. And it's, once you can sense that, it's exhilarating to feel that which transcends the limited self in you, that presence that cannot be conceptualized, that cannot be named, the Tao. This is why we're here, to experience that.
A great saint in India named Muktananda was asked the question, what is real? And he said, that is real, which never changes, period. So now you try to define yourself using that definition. Like the question Eckhardt is addressing is, who am I? And the first thing that comes to mind is, well, I'm this body, But how many bodies have you been in since you incarnated just this time? How many bodies have you shown up in? You were in one this big. You were in a little toddler body. You were in one that stands like this, like all my teenage daughters do, and roll their eyes. I was in a 20-year-old body, and I just saw a picture of it. I just did a new public television special, and I saw that picture floating across. And when I was in that body, I really believed it was real. But it's been 50 years, and I can't find it. I don't know where it is. Like there's nothing in this body. There's not one cell left over in this body that was in that body. And that's true for every single person watching and every single person in this room. So that who you are is that which keeps occupying new bodies on a regular basis. In fact, if Deepak were up here with us, he would say that the body you came in to watch this presentation with will be very different than the one that you will leave here with. Mm-hmm. We can't see the changes going on in that place, but we're in a world. So if everything that is changing isn't real, who we really are, there's a higher self within each and every one of us, or a highest self. And a higher self, to me, is one of my teachings was that the Creator puts a spark of Himself into each and every creation. So there's a spark of God in each and every one of us. But my experience, especially lately in my own life, has been that that spark can grow from a spark to a fragment, to a segment, to something bigger. It can get as big as a soccer ball. It can get bigger and bigger inside of you until you ultimately reach another conclusion, the same conclusion that Jesus came to when He was about to be stoned because He blasphemed. He said, "Why would you stone me?" And they said to Him that we stone you because you are a man and you claim to be God. And He said, "Is it not written in your laws that I have said, you are gods? You are gods." This comes right out of the mouth of Jesus. And St. Paul, writing in Philippians, in his letters to the Philippians, says, "Have in you the same mind as Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God." But we've taken this idea of this place that you're speaking of, this perfect infinite presence, this place of divine peace, and interpreted the words "I am God" or "you are God" to be the God that we've created in our own images. This God who's angry, and this God who has the power to heal, but restricts it to some and gives it to others. This God that demands payment and fancy, buildings and gold embroidered costumes and so on, and created a God like that. When in fact, again, out of the scriptures, Jesus said, when asked who is God, He said, God is love. I mean, I don't know, is there a better word for it than that?
Yes. And of course, the impermanence and the changing body or inhabiting different bodies. The same applies to the psychological, because the body is the physical form, and then that's the starting point for most people's sense of identity. That's I am this external appearance and so on. The next place that people use to define their identity through, of course, is the psychological self-image, which is also changing, which consists of the stream of thinking accompanied by certain emotions that continuously happen, that also changes from year to year who you consider yourself to be, the psychological self. So we have the double delusory identifications. One is with the physical vehicle, and then there is the identification with the mental emotional vehicle also, which is not who you are, which also is part of the continuous flux of forms. And to recognize that is already, when you recognize that, it's a kind of relief in a way. If you really consider the fact of the impermanence of the physical form and the impermanence of the psychological form, you say, wow, it's to the ego, which really ego is the identification with that gives you a sense of self. That's the ego. So to the ego, that's bad news. It says, oh, that's terrible. Everything is impermanent. I don't want to hear that. Says the ego, that's dreadful. It's depressing. Don't talk to me about death. Depressing. But there's something else in you that actually feels alive suddenly and exhilarated when you hear the fact of impermanence. And suddenly something awakens in you that is not part of the impermanence, that which does not change. And that we could call it this or that, but it's never quite right. I sometimes call it pure consciousness, the unconditioned consciousness, the formless consciousness. Thought is consciousness having been born into a form. The physical body is consciousness having been born into a temporary physical vehicle. So consciousness assumes form continuously, and that's the deeper meaning of reincarnation. One could say, every time I get caught up in a thought that arises in my head, and by caught up I mean identified with the thought has me in its power, every time that happens, I reincarnate into form, into the thought form. So you reincarnate into physical bodies, but you also reincarnate into the mind continuously, because you identify with the mind. So to stop the cycle of reincarnation, which is what the Buddhists are trying to do, but they have a kind of traditional idea of it, but the more immediate thing you can do is to don't believe in every thought that arises in your head. So you don't get caught up in every thought that arises, and you realize there is a dimension in you that is an aware presence from where you can look at a thought and see it come and go, and you can see it's negative, it has a certain vibrational quality to it, which may be high or low, and so you touch the place where you are not the physical body, where you are not the thoughts and emotions, although these are there, where you are that spacious presence, the awareness for that. That's the eternal I. And that's the light of the world. That's Jesus again, you quoted Jesus. Jesus said two things. He said, I am the light of the world. And then somewhere else he said, you are the light of the world. Both.
Right. That word I am is very big in my consciousness and in my awareness. I've just written a whole book that will be out in the spring on this whole idea of I am. It's the only place in all the scriptures in the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, in Exodus, there's Moses out there floating on a basket in the Nile, and he gets picked up by the Pharaoh's daughter and is raised as the grandson of the Pharaoh, who had ordered all male children to be drowned and so on. And then he escapes after committing a murder when he was 17 or 18 years old and defending someone from that was being persecuted, one of the Israelites. Moves out to the Sinai and is out walking one day 40 years later after he married and children, and he's a shepherd, and all of a sudden he encounters a burning bush. And this is a bush that doesn't get consumed, it just keeps burning, and a voice comes from the burning bush and says to Moses, calls out name, Moses, Moses. Now this is 1,300 years before the birth of Christ. That's 13 centuries. That's 800 years before Lao Tzu. So this is one of our most ancient texts and stories, and it's the only place where God's name is given. And God yells out Moses, and the first words that Moses says to God are, "Here I am." And then he starts telling Moses this weird story. You're going to go out and you're going to free all of your people. I'm going to send you to the promised land. You're going to free them all. And he said, who am I? Who am I to do this? He said, well, I will be with you, it says in Exodus. And finally, but he said, what is your name? He said, what am I going to say to these people? And he said, my name is I am that I am. And that shall be my name for all future generations. That is my name. So the name I am is really the name of God. And you have to ask yourself the question every time you use it. In the book of Joel it says, let the weak say, I am strong. How do you declare your I ams? Because most of your I ams are associated with your ordinariness, with your physical world, with your mind that you're speaking about. But when you begin to say, I am well, which I say to myself, and I've had a diagnosis that tells me I'm not supposed to be able to say that, but I know the greatest gift I've ever been given is the gift of my imagination, the gift of being able to place anything in there and put a do not disturb sign around it and super glue my intentions to that inner place. And you mentioned the words Jesus said, I am the way, I am the truth. He also said, I am the resurrection. He didn't say I am the crucifixion. We've placed so much emphasis on that in the world, on the suffering, and not enough, I think, on this being who is transcendent and is that being of light. But I ask every one of you watching, every one of you in here, to be very careful when you use the words I am, because you say I am weak. When Moses said, what is your name? God didn't say, my name is I hope things work out, or my name is I will be. Because to say I will be means I am not. He said, I am that I am, meaning everything that exists, I am that I am, which means you. And you can use the name, I am. And one of the things, Eckhardt, you and I talked about in preparation for doing this is not only to look at it from sort of a academic, philosophical point of view, but how can we apply what our teachings really bring to the world? Because this world we're in right now, I mean, it needs what we're speaking about here in a big way. It needs an I am God in the sense of I am love as what we walk around with in our peace and in our quiet, because this is the first time in the history of this country that a child born today's life expectancy is less than its parents'. It's never happened before. And its expectancy for earning what it can earn is seriously diminished from what its parents were. And we have, we have a nation of addicts. I mean, not just to illegal drugs and so on, but to just prescriptions. People, I mean, in the year, this will shock you, in the year 1970, there were 2 billion prescription tablets prescribed in America. 2 billion individual tablets, 1970. In 2007, one generation later, that number is 113 billion in one generation. I mean, who doesn't have 4 or 5 or 6 prescription drugs that they're taking? And I mean, my daughter just lost her best friend's fiance to an overdose of these prescription drugs, these painkillers that people are taking. Antipsychotic drugs, I mean, we're loaded with them. Not only that, but I mean, our food supply has been contaminated. I mean, it's like we have 31% of young people obese. What is going on? I mean, that's a lack of consciousness. You know, genetically modified organisms put into our foods, and violence. Last year in the city of Chicago, 242 students were shot to death in one city, in one school system. It's like just a few days ago in Nevada, somebody walked in with a Uzi or an AK-47 and blew away 7 or 8 people in Carson City. I want the people who are voting to end the sale of these massive weapons that are so capable of killing people to stand up and be counted. I mean, violence, contamination, addictions. We get enough people thinking that I am God and I am love and projecting it. I mean, one of the things I got from watching what you did with Oprah is the awareness that when we reach elevated levels of consciousness that you're speaking about, when we are totally here, now, present, that we don't just affect ourselves, but we literally affect those around us, right? I mean, is that what you're teaching? I mean,
Yes.
that was very impactful to me, that it's important for me to pay attention.